I wasn't going to share this story. Not because it isn't true, but because of how far it goes. Blind Maid. Cain raised in anger. A billionaire who thought he knew the woman he was about to marry. And one hidden camera that changed everything. Stay with me, because what happens in the middle of this story will make your stomach drop, and what happens at the end will make you believe in justice again. This isn't just a story. This really happened to someone. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why. Welcome back, friends. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found us. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one of them. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. It's about pride, cruelty hiding behind a smile, and a woman who lost her sight but never lost her dignity. It's about a man who had everything money could buy, except the truth. And when he finally found it, nothing was ever the same again. Grab something warm to drink, get comfortable, and don't skip ahead, because the ending of this story is something you will never forget. Nobody in that house knew her real name. They just called her the Blind One. Her name was Dorothy Mae Coleman, and she had been blind since she was 9 years old. A fever, the doctors said. It stole her sight but never touched her spirit. By the time she was 58, Dorothy had spent almost 30 years working as a housekeeper for wealthy families across Connecticut. She couldn't see faces, but she remembered voices. She couldn't see color, but she could feel warmth in a room the second she walked into it, or the cold, sharp silence of a house where she wasn't wanted. The Whitfield estate was the biggest house she had ever worked in. Marble floors that echoed with every step. Chandeliers she could hear humming faintly when the air conditioning kicked on. A staircase so wide that Dorothy had to count the steps under her breath every single day just to be safe. 22 steps up, 22 steps down. She had worked for Richard Whitfield for almost 4 years. Richard was the CEO of a private investment firm, a man worth more money than Dorothy could imagine, but a man who had always been kind to her. He greeted her every morning with the same words. "Morning, Dorothy. House smell good today." And every morning Dorothy would laugh and say, "Only because I made it that way, Mr. Whitfield." Richard had lost his mother young, and something about Dorothy's steady voice, her patience, her quiet strength, reminded him of a kindness he thought he'd lost. He trusted her with the house. He trusted her with his late mother's jewelry box, which no one else was allowed to touch. He trusted her, period. But 6 months ago, everything in that house began to change. Richard got engaged. Her name was Vanessa Cole, 34 years old, stunning, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and make every head turn. She came from old money that had quietly disappeared years before anyone noticed, but she carried herself like she still owned every room she entered. To the outside world, Vanessa was charming, graceful, endlessly kind on camera, at galas, in front of Richard's friends. But behind closed doors, in the empty hallways where she thought no one was watching, Vanessa was someone else entirely. Dorothy noticed it first in small things. The way Vanessa's voice changed the second Richard left the room. Sweet and syrupy 1 second, ice cold the next. The way she'd accidentally leave wet umbrellas on the marble floor and blame Dorothy if anyone slipped. The way she'd complain to Richard about reckless housekeeping, always somehow making Dorothy the villain, always when Richard wasn't there to see the truth for himself. Dorothy couldn't see Vanessa's face. But she didn't need to. She could hear it in every word. "You missed a spot," Vanessa would snap, though Dorothy had cleaned that same spot 3 times that morning. "Watch where you're going," she'd hiss, even when Dorothy was standing perfectly still. At first, Dorothy told herself it was nerves. Wedding stress. New money marrying old money. Trying to prove herself worthy of a house this large. She told herself people can be short-tempered under pressure, and she had seen worse in her 30 years of service. She kept her head down. She did her work. She prayed every night that things would settle once the wedding was behind them. She had no idea that things were about to get so much worse. She had no idea that in just a few weeks, Vanessa's cruelty would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, a line that would be caught, completely by accident, on camera. And she had absolutely no idea that the man she trusted most in that house, the man who greeted her every single morning with warmth in his voice, was about to see a version of his fiancée that would break something inside him forever. Because in 3 days, Vanessa was going to raise a cane against a blind woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. And Richard Whitfield was going to walk in at the exact wrong moment, or as fate would have it, the exact right one. Dorothy heard the front door slam before she heard the screaming. It was a Tuesday morning in early October. Richard had left for a business trip to Chicago 2 days earlier, and the house felt different when he was gone. Quieter, colder, like the walls themselves knew something was wrong. Dorothy had learned over the past few months that Vanessa's true colors only ever came out when Richard wasn't home to witness them. That morning, Dorothy was polishing the banister along the grand staircase, counting her steps the way she always did, running her fingers along the smooth wood the way she'd done 1,000 times before. She heard heels clicking sharply against the marble. Fast, agitated, coming closer. "Where is it?" Vanessa's voice cut through the silence like glass breaking. "Where's what, ma'am?" Dorothy asked calmly, straightening up. "My bracelet. The diamond one. It was on my nightstand and now it's gone." Dorothy's stomach tightened, not from fear, but from familiarity. This wasn't the first time something had gone missing, only to turn up exactly where it had always been. "I haven't been in your room this morning, ma'am. I was told not to clean the east wing until noon." "Don't lie to me," Vanessa snapped, her voice rising with every word. "You're the only one who has access to this house all day. Who else would take it?" "I would never take anything that wasn't mine," Dorothy said, keeping her voice steady even as her heart began to pound. "You know that. I've worked here 4 years. "I don't know anything about you," Vanessa spat. "I know that ever since I got here, you've had some kind of problem with me." Dorothy said nothing. There was nothing to say to a woman who had already decided the story before it began. That's when she heard it, the sound of something long and wooden sliding across the floor. Vanessa had grabbed the antique cane that sat decoratively by the coat rack near the front door, a relic from Richard's grandfather that had never been touched, let alone used. "Ma'am, what are you?" The first strike landed across Dorothy's shoulder before she could even finish the sentence. Pain exploded through her arm and she stumbled, her white cane clattering to the marble floor, her hands flying up instinctively to protect her face. She couldn't see it coming. She couldn't see anything at all, only sound, only impact, only the sharp gasp that tore from her own throat. "You ungrateful, thieving." Vanessa's voice cracked with rage, each word punctuated by another swing of the cane. "I will not be disrespected in my own home." "Please," Dorothy cried out, crouching low, one arm shielding her head. "Please, I didn't take anything, I swear to you." "Liar." Another strike. This one caught Dorothy across the back, and she cried out, sinking to her knees on the cold marble floor, her white cane rolling just out of reach. For nearly a full minute, the only sounds in that grand marble foyer were Vanessa's furious voice and the sickening crack of wood against a defenseless woman's body, a woman who could not see the blows coming, who had nothing to defend herself with except her own trembling hands. And that is exactly the moment the front door opened. Richard Whitfield had come home 3 days early. He stood frozen in the doorway, his suitcase still in hand, his flight bag slung over one shoulder, watching a scene his mind refused to process for one horrifying, endless second. His fiancée. A cane raised above her head. Dorothy, sweet, gentle Dorothy, who had cared for this house and everyone in it for 4 years, curled on the floor, blood on her lip, sunglasses knocked sideways on her face. "Vanessa!" The cane froze in midair. And in that single frozen second, Richard Whitfield's entire world silently, permanently cracked in half. The sound of his own voice screaming her name didn't even feel real to him. Richard dropped his suitcase. It hit the marble floor with a crash that echoed through the entire foyer, but he barely heard it. His legs carried him across the room before his mind had even caught up with what his eyes were seeing. "What are you doing?" His voice came out low, shaking, almost unrecognizable to himself. "Vanessa, what is wrong with you?" Vanessa spun around, the cane still gripped tightly in her hand, and for just a flash of a second, barely long enough to notice, her face shifted. Fear. Panic. And then, like a mask sliding perfectly back into place, something else entirely. "Richard! Thank God you're home." Her voice cracked with practiced desperation. "She attacked me. She's been stealing from us for months, and when I confronted her, she came at me and I had to defend myself." "Stop!" Richard's voice cut through hers like a blade. He was already on his knees beside Dorothy, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her wrong. "Dorothy! Dorothy, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Dorothy's hands were shaking as she reached for her cane. Her sunglasses knocked askew, revealing eyes clouded pale from decades of blindness. Blood trickled from a small cut on her lip. "Mr. Whitfield," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady in a way that broke his heart more than tears would have. "I didn't take anything. I swear on my life, I didn't take anything from that room." "I know," Richard said, and something in his tone made both women in that room go completely still. "I know you didn't." "She's lying to you," Vanessa said quickly, stepping closer, her voice climbing an octave. "Richard, baby, she's manipulating you. She's blind. She probably felt around, found my bracelet and—" "How did you know she couldn't see the cane coming?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above all three of them. Vanessa blinked. "What? You said she came at you and you had to defend yourself." Richard rose to his feet slowly. His eyes locked on his fiancée like he was seeing her for the very first time. "Dorothy is blind, Vanessa. She has been blind for almost 30 years. Explain to me exactly how a blind woman with a walking cane attacked you hard enough that you needed to beat her nearly unconscious with my grandfather's antique cane." Silence. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. The mask was slipping, and for the first time, Richard could see the panic underneath it. Real panic, the kind that comes when a carefully built lie suddenly has nowhere left to go. She came at me, I felt threatened, I didn't mean to hit her that many times, I just—" "Enough." Richard's voice was quiet now, and somehow that was worse than shouting. "Get out of my sight. Right now. Richard. Now." Vanessa's heels clicked away sharply, retreating up the grand staircase, but Richard didn't watch her go. He was already crouched beside Dorothy again, gently helping her to her feet, one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said. "And then I'm calling my lawyer. Mr. Whitfield, please, I don't want any trouble, I just want to go home." "Dorothy." Richard's voice cracked, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, he sounded like he might cry. "You've been in trouble in my house for months, and I didn't see it. I'm so sorry. I promise you, that woman is never stepping foot in this house again." But what Richard didn't know yet, what he was about to discover within the hour, was that this wasn't the first time. And thanks to a small security camera hidden discreetly above the coat rack, one that Richard had installed himself 2 years earlier after a break-in scare, every single moment of Vanessa's cruelty, going back for months, had been recorded. Every insult, every slammed door, every moment Dorothy had suffered in silence, believing no one would ever believe her. It was all there, waiting to be seen, What Richard found in that footage made his hands shake so badly he could barely hold the tablet. The ambulance had come and gone. Dorothy had 2 bruised ribs, a split lip, and a hairline fracture in her left forearm where she tried to shield herself from the blows. The paramedics said she was lucky it wasn't worse. Richard didn't feel lucky. He felt sick. He sat alone in his study that night, the security footage app open on his tablet, his finger hovering over the timeline. 2 years of footage. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, only that he needed to understand how long this had been happening, how long he had been blind himself, sighted but blind in every way that mattered. He started 3 months back, around the time the wedding planning had picked up. What he found stole the breath from his lungs. There was Vanessa in the kitchen, accidentally, knocking a glass of red wine onto Dorothy's clean tile floor and then screaming at her for the mess. There was Vanessa in the hallway, hissing insults just quiet enough that Richard, upstairs in his office, would never have heard them. There was Vanessa, 3 weeks earlier, snatching Dorothy's white cane out of her hands and hiding it behind a curtain as a joke, laughing coldly while Dorothy felt along the walls in a panic, trying to find her way to a chair. Richard's stomach turned. He kept scrolling. Then he found the footage from that morning. The real footage. Not the version Vanessa had tried to sell him, but every single second, time-stamped and undeniable. Vanessa storming down the stairs, already furious before she'd even said a word to Dorothy. Vanessa grabbing the cane off the coat rack with deliberate, calculated cruelty. And then the beating itself, captured in horrifying clarity, 23 seconds that felt like they lasted a lifetime. Richard watched it twice. He couldn't stop himself. He needed to know with absolute certainty that what he remembered seeing when he walked through that door was exactly what had happened. It was worse. Because in the footage, he could hear things he'd missed in his shock. Dorothy begging, apologizing for something she hadn't even done. Her voice shaking with a fear that told Richard this had happened before, many times, just never quite this badly. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez who had handled his family's affairs for 15 years. "Patricia, I need you to come to the house tonight. I have security footage of assault, and I need to know my legal options. All of them." "Richard, it's 10 at night, what's going on?" "My fiancée," Richard said, his voice hollow, "beat my housekeeper with a cane this morning. My blind housekeeper. And I have 2 years of footage showing this wasn't the first time she's terrorized this woman. I want her charged. I want the engagement ended. And I want to make sure Dorothy Coleman never has to worry about a single medical bill or a single day of missed pay for the rest of her life." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Patricia said quietly. "Richard, I'm so sorry." Richard hung up the phone and sat alone in the dim light of his study, staring at the frozen frame on his tablet. Vanessa's face twisted with rage, the cane raised high above a woman who had never once, in 4 years, given anyone in that house a single reason for cruelty. He thought about the ring sitting in a velvet box in his top desk drawer, the one he'd been so excited to give her just 8 months ago. He thought about every gala, every dinner party, every moment Vanessa had smiled sweetly for cameras and charmed his business partners. He thought about how easily he had been fooled. And somewhere upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, Vanessa Cole had no idea that the entire foundation of the life she'd built for herself was about to collapse. Not because someone had told on her, but because a small camera above a coat rack had quietly, patiently, recorded the truth the entire time. Vanessa thought she still had time to fix things. She was wrong. Upstairs, Vanessa paced her bedroom floor, her mind racing through excuses, apologies, tears she could summon on command if she needed to. She'd done this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. A slammed door here, a screaming match there. Always smoothed over eventually with the right amount of charm and the right amount of crying. Richard loved her. Richard forgave things. That's what she told herself over and over, as she heard a car pull into the driveway an hour later. A car she didn't recognize. She crept to her window and looked down. A woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out of a black sedan, carrying a briefcase, walking with a kind of purpose that made Vanessa's stomach drop. Lawyer. Richard had called a lawyer. Panic set in fast. Vanessa grabbed her phone and called the one person she trusted most in situations like this. Her mother, Carol, a woman who had spent 30 years teaching her daughter that appearances mattered more than truth, that the right tears in the right moment could undo almost any mistake. "Mom, I need help." Richard's furious. "There was an incident with the housekeeper, and I think he's calling a lawyer." "What kind of incident?" Carol's voice was sharp, businesslike, already calculating damage control. "It doesn't matter. I need you to help me fix this. I need you to help me talk to him." "Vanessa." Her mother's voice grew cold. "What did you do?" Vanessa hesitated. "I lost my temper. With a maid. The blind one." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. "You hit her," Carol said flatly. "It wasn't a question. She was accusing me of things, Mom, she was lying about." "Vanessa Marie Cole, is there footage?" The question hit Vanessa like a slap. Her mind raced back to the coat rack, to the small discreet camera she'd noticed once months ago, and dismissed as nothing more than decoration. Her blood went cold. "I don't know," she whispered. "Then get out of that house right now before that lawyer walks up those stairs." But it was too late. There was a knock at the door. Firm, deliberate. Richard's voice on the other side. Quiet in a way that terrified her far more than shouting ever could. "Vanessa, open the door. Patricia and I need to speak with you." Vanessa hung up on her mother without another word, smoothed her hair, wiped away tears that hadn't even started falling yet, and forced her face into the practiced expression of wounded innocence she had used 100 times before. She opened the door. "Richard, baby, I am so sorry about earlier, I just lost control for a second, I would never normally." "Sit down, Vanessa." Something in his voice made her stop mid-sentence. This wasn't the Richard she knew. The generous, easily reassured Richard who always wanted to believe the best about her. This man's eyes were flat, exhausted, and utterly unmoved. Patricia Alvarez stepped into the room, opened her laptop, and turned the screen toward Vanessa without a word. The footage began to play. Vanessa watched herself in high-definition clarity, screaming at a blind woman over a bracelet that, as Richard would reveal moments later, had been sitting exactly where Vanessa left it, tangled in a bathrobe pocket the entire time. She watched herself raise the cane. She watched, in horrifying real-time 23 seconds of a person she barely recognized as herself. "I found the bracelet an hour ago," Richard said quietly, once the footage ended. "It was never missing. You beat an innocent, blind woman half unconscious over nothing. Over absolutely nothing, Vanessa." Vanessa's carefully constructed composure finally shattered completely. And this time when the tears came, they were real. "Richard, please, I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," Richard said, his voice breaking for just a moment before hardening again. "The engagement is over. I want you out of this house by morning. And Dorothy Coleman is pressing charges, with my full legal support and my full financial backing for as long as it takes." Nobody expected Dorothy to be the one who almost stopped the whole thing. The next morning, Patricia Alvarez sat across from Dorothy in a quiet, sunlit room at the hospital, gently explaining the legal process. The assault charges, the civil suit Richard wanted to pursue on her behalf, the compensation being offered that would ensure Dorothy never had to worry about medical bills, lost wages, or her future again. Dorothy sat very still, her bandaged arm resting in her lap, and shook her head slowly. "I don't want to cause trouble for anybody," she said quietly. "I just want to go back to my life. I don't need a courtroom. I don't need money." G. with visible pain in his expression. "Dorothy," Richard said, stepping closer, kneeling down beside her chair so he was at eye level, even though she couldn't see him. "This isn't about causing trouble. This is about making sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else in that house, or any house. Vanessa has done this before. Not exactly like this, but pieces of it. Small cruelties. If nothing happens now, she'll do it again to someone else. Maybe someone who won't have a camera watching." Dorothy's jaw tightened. "I've spent 30 years being told to keep my head down, Mr. Whitfield. Being told that people like her word matters more than mine. I appreciate everything you're offering me, I truly do. But I'm scared. What if it's not enough? What if the courts don't believe a blind maid over a rich man's fiancée, camera or not?" The room fell silent. It was Richard who finally spoke, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "Then I'll stand right there next to you and say it myself, as many times as it takes, until they believe every single word." Dorothy's chin trembled, and for the first time since the attack, tears slipped silently down her face. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to disbelief. In 30 years of service, in 30 years of being underestimated, overlooked, and quietly mistreated by employers who saw her as invisible help rather than a human being, this was the first time someone with real power had ever looked her in the face. Figuratively, since she couldn't see him, and meant it when they said they'd stand beside her. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. I'll do it. Not for the money. For every person like me who's ever been too scared to say something." Patricia smiled softly and began pulling out paperwork. But 3 days later, just as the case was gaining momentum, something happened that no one saw coming. Something that would test every ounce of Richard's resolve and threaten to unravel the entire case before it ever reached a courtroom. Vanessa's family had money too. Not as much as Richard, but enough. And enough connections to make things complicated. A private investigator showed up at Dorothy's small apartment that Thursday evening, hired quietly by Carol Cole, digging for anything. Any inconsistency, any past complaint, any excuse to paint Dorothy as unreliable, dishonest, or exaggerating. They found something. Something small. Something twisted just enough to almost destroy everything. A single old complaint, buried 8 years deep, nearly ended everything. The investigator's name was Marcus Bell, a sharp, unscrupulous man who specialized in exactly this kind of work, digging up whatever he could find, twisting it however his clients needed. He found it in an old employment file from a previous job Dorothy had held nearly a decade earlier, before she'd come to work for the Whitfields. An elderly employer, now deceased, had once filed a minor complaint against Dorothy, claiming a small piece of jewelry had gone missing during her employment. The claim had never been substantiated. No charges were ever filed. The family later found the missing bracelet themselves, misplaced in a drawer, and quietly apologized to Dorothy, who had continued working there for another 2 years without incident. But none of that context mattered to Carol Cole. All she needed was the headline. Within a week, gossip columns and local news blogs were running stories. Housekeeper suing billionaire's ex-fiancé has history of theft allegations. Vanessa's legal team leaked the old complaint strategically, twisting an old, resolved misunderstanding into something that sounded exactly like the lie Vanessa had originally tried to tell. Dorothy was devastated. She sat in Richard's study, her hands trembling in her lap, listening as Patricia read the headlines aloud in a careful, gentle voice. "They're calling me a thief," Dorothy whispered. "After everything, they're going to make people believe I deserved what happened to me." "No," Richard said firmly, sitting across from her. His voice steady even though fury simmered just beneath the surface. "They're trying to make people believe that, and there's a difference. We're going to fight it, Dorothy. That old case was resolved. There's documentation. There are witnesses. I will get every single one of them on record if that's what it takes." But Dorothy shook her head slowly, and for the first time since the attack, something in her posture crumbled. "Mr. Whitfield, I appreciate you, I do. But maybe this isn't worth it. Maybe I should just drop the case, take whatever settlement your lawyer offers privately, and disappear quietly. I don't want to be a headline. I've spent my whole life staying invisible, and now the whole country thinks I'm a criminal." Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Dorothy had ever heard it. "Do you know why I installed that camera 2 years ago?" Dorothy shook her head. "Because after my mother passed, I was terrified of losing anything else that mattered. I thought that camera was there to protect my house, my belongings, my property." He paused, and Dorothy could hear the emotion thick in his throat. "I didn't understand until 3 days ago that it was there to protect something far more important. It was there to protect the truth. And the truth is on your side, Dorothy. Every time. I am not going to let one ugly, twisted headline undo 4 years of knowing exactly who you are." Dorothy's tears fell freely now, and this time she reached out, finding Richard's hand by instinct, gripping it tightly. "All right," she whispered. "All right. We fight." What neither of them knew yet was that the old employer's daughter, a woman named Grace, now in her 40s, living quietly in Vermont, had seen the headlines online. And she was about to come forward with the truth herself, unprompted, because she remembered exactly what had really happened all those years ago. And she was not about to let a good woman's name be dragged through the mud for a crime that never happened. Grace's phone call changed the entire direction of the case. It came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 9 days after the headlines broke. Patricia's office phone rang, and a woman introduced herself simply as Grace Whitmore, explaining that she'd once been the daughter of Eleanor Whitmore, the elderly employer who had filed that long-forgotten complaint against Dorothy Coleman 8 years earlier. "I saw the news," Grace said, her voice steady but urgent. "I need you to know the truth because what's being said isn't fair, and it isn't right." Grace explained everything in careful detail. Her mother had been in the early stages of dementia at the time of the complaint, often misplacing items and then panicking, accusing whoever was nearby. The missing bracelet had turned up 3 weeks later, exactly where Eleanor herself had hidden it in a shoebox at the back of her closet, a habit brought on by her declining memory. Grace and her siblings had apologized profusely to Dorothy at the time, horrified by the accusation, and Dorothy, gracious even then, had simply nodded and said she understood, that she held no hard feelings, and continued caring for their mother with the same gentle patience as always for 2 more years, right up until Eleanor's passing. "Dorothy Coleman is one of the kindest, most honest people I have ever known," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "She took care of my mother when the rest of us were too busy, too far away, too overwhelmed to do it ourselves. I will testify to that in any courtroom, in front of any camera, as many times as it takes. What's happening to her right now is disgusting, and I refuse to stay silent." Patricia could barely contain her relief as she thanked Grace and immediately began preparing the documentation. When Richard shared the news with Dorothy that evening, sitting together in the same study where so much had already unfolded, Dorothy was quiet for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said softly, almost fondly. "I used to read to her every evening, you know. She loved old poetry. Robert Frost mostly." Dorothy smiled faintly, a smile tinged with old grief. I never held that complaint against her. She was sick and scared and confused. I understood. You understood, Richard repeated quietly, shaking his head with something like awe. After everything you've been through, after everything Vanessa's family has tried to do to you, you're sitting here defending the woman who once falsely accused you too. That's not what strength looks like on the outside, Mr. Whitfield, Dorothy said gently. But it's what it feels like on the inside. Holding on to anger costs more than most people realize. I let that go a long time ago. But this, her voice hardened slightly, what Vanessa did to me was different. That wasn't confusion. That was cruelty, plain and simple. And cruelty deserves consequences. With Grace's testimony now added to the overwhelming security footage evidence, the twisted old headline collapsed within days, replaced instead by a wave of public sympathy and outrage on Dorothy's behalf. Local news picked up the real story. National outlets followed soon after. What Carol Cole had hoped would destroy Dorothy's credibility instead became the very thing that cemented public support entirely in her favor. Vanessa's carefully built reputation, meanwhile, was collapsing in real time, and the trial date was now only 2 weeks away. The courtroom was silent when Dorothy finally spoke for herself. The trial began on a cold, gray morning in late November. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, curious onlookers, a handful of Richard's business associates who had come out of quiet solidarity, and Grace Whitmore, seated in the front row exactly as she'd promised. Vanessa sat beside her defense attorney, pale and visibly shaken, a shadow of the confident, magnetic woman who had once charmed an entire room with a single smile. Her mother sat behind her, stone-faced, still clinging to the hope that money and connections could somehow undo what the footage had already made undeniable. The prosecution played the security footage first. The courtroom fell into a heavy, horrified silence as 23 seconds of cruelty played out on the screen for everyone to see. Several jurors visibly flinched. One older woman in the jury box quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Then it was Dorothy's turn to speak. She was helped to the stand by a bailiff, her white cane tapping gently against the floor, her sunglasses steady, her back straight despite the healing fracture still wrapped beneath her sleeve. She had practiced this moment with Patricia for days, but when she finally opened her mouth, the words that came out were entirely her own. "I've been blind for almost 50 years, Dorothy began, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent courtroom. In that time I've learned that people often assume that because I can't see them, I also can't understand them. That I'm somehow less aware, less capable, less deserving of basic respect." Pause. "I have spent 30 years cleaning other people's houses, raising other people's memories from dust, and doing it with pride, because honest work is never something to be ashamed of." She turned her face slightly, unerringly, toward where Vanessa sat, as though she could somehow feel exactly where she was. "On October the 7th, I was beaten with a cane by a woman who decided, without any evidence, without a single moment of doubt, that I was less than human. That my pain didn't matter because I couldn't see the blows coming. That my word wouldn't matter because who would believe a blind maid over a beautiful, wealthy woman?" Dorothy's voice trembled slightly now, but she pressed on. "I am not here today for revenge. I am here because somewhere out there is another person, blind or elderly or simply powerless in some way, who is being hurt right now by someone who believes they'll never be caught, never be believed, never be seen. I want them to know that the truth always finds its way into the light, even when you can't see it coming yourself." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the judge, a woman known for her stern, unreadable expression, had gone quiet, her pen still against her notepad. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, he asked only a handful of weak, half-hearted questions before sitting back down, visibly aware that there was truly nothing left to say. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Vanessa Cole was found guilty of aggravated assault. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, mandatory anger management and psychological treatment, and was ordered to pay full restitution for Dorothy's medical expenses and emotional damages, on top of the substantial civil settlement Richard had already arranged, which would ensure Dorothy's financial security for the rest of her life. As Vanessa was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned briefly toward Dorothy, her mouth opening as if to say something. An apology, an excuse, something. But no words came. There was nothing left to say. Dorothy simply sat with her chin lifted, calm and unshaken, as the woman who had once tried to break her walked out of that courtroom for the very last time. 1 year later, everything about Dorothy's life had changed, but not in the way anyone expected. Richard never returned to that grand, echoing house the same way again. He sold it within 6 months of the trial, unable to walk past that staircase, that coat rack, without seeing the moment his entire understanding of the world had shattered and rebuilt itself. He bought a smaller home instead, warm, modest by his standards, filled with sunlight instead of chandeliers. Dorothy never returned to housework. With the settlement Richard insisted on providing, she was finally able to retire in comfort, something she had genuinely believed would never happen for a woman like her. But retirement, as it turned out, wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Inspired by everything she'd survived, Dorothy partnered with a local non-profit organization dedicated to protecting elderly and disabled workers from abuse and exploitation. She began sharing her story carefully, gently, in her own time, at community centers, churches, and eventually disability advocacy conferences across the country. She helped draft new workplace protections that specifically addressed the vulnerability of blind and disabled domestic workers, protections that would go on to be adopted in 3 different states within 2 years. Richard funded the foundation quietly, insisting his name stay out of the headlines. This wasn't about him, he said. It never had been. He and Dorothy remained close, an unlikely friendship forged from tragedy but strengthened by something far deeper: mutual respect, and an understanding neither of them could have predicted a year earlier. Every few weeks, Richard would visit Dorothy at her new home, a small, sunlit house with a garden she tended by feel and memory, roses she could identify by scent alone. "You know," Dorothy told him one afternoon, sitting together on her porch as autumn leaves rustled softly in the wind, "I used to believe that being invisible was the safest way to survive in this world. Keep your head down, do your work, don't make waves, don't ask for more than you're given." "And now?" Richard asked gently. Dorothy smiled, tilting her face toward the warm autumn sun she couldn't see but could still feel. "Now I know that being seen, truly seen for exactly who you are, is worth every risk it takes to get there. It just took the right person finally walking through that door at the right moment." Richard reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'll always be grateful I did," he said quietly. "Some people spend their whole lives blind to the truth right in front of them, even with perfect vision. You taught me to actually see." Friends, if this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while I wrote it, I need you to sit with this for just 1 second. Dorothy Coleman spent 30 years being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed simply because of the way the world chose to see her, or rather refused to. But the truth she carried inside her never wavered, not once, even in her darkest moment on that marble floor. The lesson here is simple, but it's one so many of us forget in our busiest, loudest moments. Never judge someone's strength, someone's honesty, or someone's worth by how loud they are, how powerful they seem, or how easily the world chooses to believe them. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are carrying the heaviest truths. And sometimes it takes just one person willing to walk through the right door at the right moment to finally set that truth free. If this story touched your heart today, please hit that like button. It truly helps this story reach someone else who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we have so many more stories just like this one waiting to be told. And if you know someone who could use a little reminder today that truth and kindness always find their way to the light eventually, share this with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.